First, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to get hold of the mic. You know, as the festival director, I've just been handing out mementos, nothing else. I've almost come to think that that's the only thing I'm good at now. Maybe the next half an hour will tell this limited audience and you know, the YouTube audience later that I can speak and I can, you know, have an intelligent conversation as well. On a serious note, we've seen a plethora of books which have tried to dissect various angles around India, you know, whether it is markets and consumers or politics. But we haven't seen too many books which have taken all of these areas, you know, economics, behavior, politics, mythology maybe, and sort of strung them all together, weave them so beautifully into one single piece of work as yours. So what really prompted you and Rupa to work on this?
Thank you. First, I should say thanks again, Kumar, for having us at the festival. It's a real pleasure to be here, and we've heard only great things about how your first run-through, as it were, is gone, so we wish you all the best for future editions of the festival. And thanks to all of you for coming. To take your question, Kumar, you know, we were struck when Random House approached us to write this book, now I guess about 3 years ago when we first talked to Random House. You know, there are a lot of interesting books on India, and if I can caricature and be a little mischievous, they tend to be either very big macro books, sort of explaining everything about India, thousands of years of history and the economy and politics, everything in 1,000 pages. And they're very micro books that look, for instance, at a specific community, a particular group, a particular sector, the lives of individuals, you know, in a very small space. You can see that those two approaches are in a way complementary. The macro, sort of the top down, and then from the micro, the reader is invited to make some inferences, perhaps, about the broader Indian reality. So here we want to do something a little different. Neither the sort of big picture, macro, top down. So we're not looking at, you know, reopening old debates about economic reform and monetary policy and trade policy, all that kind of great stuff that I do work on in my academic work. Nor are we taking a very micro approach, but taking, we think, an interesting, we hope interesting to the reader approach, where we pick and choose a couple of interesting episodes, historical episodes, contemporary problems, and weave together economics, political science, psychology, study of religion. In fact, Devdutt, who is next door, in fact, figures in one of our chapters in the book, and try and give, therefore, we think, a more holistic and more interesting perspective. And also, of course, it all sounds very pedantic, but make the book a fun read as well.
You've touched upon the 2004 elections in your book, and we're coming up into the election year next year as well. We're going to hear from you. What do you think went wrong in 2004 by the people who voted, and what do you think is going to pan out next year? You know, so an entire journey. You know, 2 years of the two terms of the UPA.
Sure. Now you raised an interesting question, and we think this is one of the more provocative bits in the book, chapters in the book, where we look in some detail at the 2004 general election. Now, there are a couple of interesting questions about that election. One question is, why did the polls, because polling has been very big, and polling is, you're all looking at polls now about, already about next year's elections. The polls got it spectacularly wrong in 2004. As you know, many of you know, all of the polls predicted a big re-election victory for the NDA, and we know how wrong those polls were. So we spent some time really looking at this very carefully. But first, here's the conventional answer that you've all read, and when we still read, which is, what's the usual story? We all know, we all are told one narrative, that it was India shining that backfired, right? This was sort of this very aggressive, triumphalist, look how well we're doing, you know, India's been, and that it was sort of a blowback against triumphalist campaign by the BJP. Now, that narrative has gotten so encrusted that it's almost impossible to think about the 2004 election, you know, except in those terms. Now, what's interesting is, if you actually look at the data, look at the numbers, that story is wrong. There's actually a much simpler explanation for what happened in 2004, and if you were to boil it down and sort of, you know, parse it, it was bad luck. There was about a 2 percentage point gap between the NDA and the UPA, or what became the UPA, in 2004. And that plus the quirkiness of our first past the post system, the UPA, or the Congress in particular, got a magnified translation of vote shares into seats. And those two things help explain why the NDA lost and why the UPA came into existence, came into power. Now, what's interesting about this, a couple of things. The defeated BJP themselves very quickly bought into this explanation. And senior leaders who are still around today said, yes, we made a mistake. It takes more than 5 years for the economy to develop, and we should have been much more cautious. So that's the lesson that they drew. And I think, and this is not in the book, but my own view is that it's had a very damaging effect on economic policy making in India in the last 9 years. And we talked about this at the inaugural session yesterday. The other question is, so then why did the polls get it so wrong? And why should we be very skeptical and very cautious as we approach 2014? And all the polls we're seeing now, and in fact, I wrote about this in Biz Standard a few weeks ago, that there are many polls now, who's the most popular PM candidate, and Mr. Modi comes out way ahead in those polls, but that one often fails to see, is that if you look at those polls, they're often, to put it mildly, methodologically very suspect, very dubious. And the lessons of 2004, which we all ought to have drawn, really hasn't been done. In 2004, without, again, going into too many gory details, there were at least 2 or 3 major kinds of errors, biases that came in. The biggest was sampling error. And the simplest way to think about it is that the BJP's natural constituency, urban middle-class voters, were heavily oversampled. And that's, if you want to give one explanation, that's the one biggest reason why all the polls predicted a huge NDA victory or BJP victory, because their vote base were the ones who were being sampled. And the ones who would vote for someone else, Congress or left or whoever it was, were undersampled. The second is response bias, okay, which is when you ask someone, they may not always tell you the truth about whom they actually wanted to vote for. And the third is what I mentioned, is this very peculiar way our first past the post system works. So there's a very sort of a non-linear mapping from votes into seats, especially in contests where there are 3 or more viable parties and in which the victory margins, the winning margins, are very small. A very small change in the margin of victory can lead to big swings in the seat shares. UP election, has in fact showed that as well.
So what do you see happening in 2014? And here I'm not talking about just the polling, but more from the political sort of scenario emerging, especially in the last sort of 2 weeks. Do you see that playing out very differently from what the popular press opinion is currently?
Well, now we also have a chapter in the book where we warn against expert prediction and how most pundits get it wrong. So I want to stick true to that. I just say that one wants to be very cautious, particularly looking at all the polls, because these polls are being heavily hyped in the media. But in Indian media, unlike the Western media, don't report the margins of errors of these polls, right? They don't often. You've got to look at the fine print to see what was the sample size. There was one poll that was much touted. This is what I was looking at in Biz Standard, that sampled 200 people in Mumbai. Now, come on. That's just, and then to extrapolate from that, make inferences about how, forget about Bombay or Mumbai, how India is going to vote based on that. A couple of thousand people sampled in a few big metros. Be cautious, be skeptical when you see these polls, and look at the methodology. Was the sample random? Because that's the key, right? Again, without boring you with all of the details, you can have a small sample, but if you've sampled randomly, then that's the best you can do given your sample, right?
Do you find that a common scenario in all of the, let's say, globalized economies? Do you think it is because of globalization, or is it something which is more peculiar to India?
That's a great question, Kumar. And one of the things that I didn't mention that we try to do in the book as well is to sort of debunk some myths and conventional wisdom. And this is one of these. This is just how we are. We're apathetic. We don't care. Or it's globalization and the market system, market economy, capitalism have made us apathetic. One hears these things all the time. In fact, what's interesting is that China has had the same kind of debate. So every time there's a major episode, so it's a very common occurrence in India. that someone falls or is injured on the roadside, no one comes to help, and that person bleeds to death, or finally someone shows up, takes them to the hospital. And then these debates come up. In fact, think back to December and the tragic rape case in Delhi. And one of the facts that was much commented on in the media was that the young woman and her friend were thrown from the bus and left to die at the roadside. And it took an hour or more before someone came and took them to the hospital. But there were passers-by who went by and did nothing. Whenever this happens in India, there was the Reuben, Reuben and Keenan Santos, right, 2 years ago. Same thing happened, right? They were left on the roadside and people just walked by. And the same debate broke out. I mean, commentators and said, well, what has happened to us? We've lost our moral compass. Interestingly, the Chinese have had the same kind of debate when similar things have happened there. So we wanted to probe this a little more deeply. And if you look at it, there are actually very good reasons, just based on the incentives an individual faces, whether to help or not to help. So again, without boring everyone, we delve quite deeply into the whole behavioral psychology literature. We look at evolutionary biology, what are the sources of altruism in human beings. Again, to boil it down, whatever altruistic impulse someone might have, someone we would like to help, the deck is stacked against you in India. We don't have a Good Samaritan law, for one thing, which many countries do have, which is that if you try to help someone, and let's say despite your best efforts that person dies or succumbs to their injuries, that you're protected from prosecution, except obviously in the case of gross negligence. But there's a basic legal protection for would-be helpers, for would-be saviors. In US, Canada, many countries have this, and we don't have that. We have kind of a vague Supreme Court injunction, which does not become, doesn't have the force of a law. So that's one thing right away. And the second is more basic and a basic ground reality, which we all know as Indians, which is no one wants to get mixed up with the cops. That's just not a good scene, right? Because you're going to be stuck probably for hours, you could actually be harassed by the cops. There are cases where people have tried to help, and then the cops turn around and accuse them of being the perpetrator, or there have been cases where the victim themselves, you would think would be grateful for being helped, turns around, and then someone gets stuck paying the hospital bill. So all of these reasons, make it someone who wants to help, is willing to help, think twice. And one of the things we look at in the book is we look at the work of a fabulous NGO called Save Life Foundation, which is a Delhi NGO, which has tried to actually work with understanding this problem, set up a system where they have volunteers, so it's a Delhi NGO, where they have volunteers at sort of major sort of junctions which have a large number of road accidents, traffic fatalities. And these volunteers are trained in basic life support, CPR, and so on. Most importantly, they're vetted in advance. The local police know who they are. And these people are doing it partly out of altruism, partly because they get some small token of recognition from this. And this is now, it's a pilot project, but it's worked remarkably well. It's not that we are just that way only, that we're apathetic, but given the incentives that people face, they make that choice.
So you're seeing that as an example of the right kind of incentives actually changing public behavior.
Exactly.
Towards the rest of the society, if you will.
And that's very basic economics. I mean, incentives do matter.
Right. So you touched upon China. Let's sort of take the conversation in that direction for a bit. Again, a lot of literature comparing India versus China, comparing the size of the economies, or rather the projected size and their importance on the world stage. Why don't you spend some time on the societies, the economics, the politics of sort of these two nations?
Now, again, I'm going to sort of stick to what we look at in the book, which is we have one chapter where we want to compare how democracies have done versus non-democratic authoritarian regimes, because there's a widely shared perception, and we report some quite striking opinion polls in India. Now, again, of course, you should take all polls with a grain of salt, but to the extent that you believe these polls, that show that, you know, something like 50 or 60% of people actually wouldn't mind or would prefer some kind of authoritarian, strong leader to fix problems, fix corruption, you know, and get so on. So there seems to be an appetite, again, at least if you believe these polls, and people, when push comes to shove, you know, who actually wants to give up democratic freedoms that we enjoy. But there is this, and again, this harks back to an older debate in political science and economics, which is it true, as many people believe, that authoritarian regimes, non-democratic regimes, deliver higher growth, better development? That widely held view in many places that the reason that China has done so well is because of their autocratic political system. When we get tied up, you know, in our system with endless bickering, with parties calculating, you know, short-term political advantage. So there is that view, and there are some very major and very respected scholars who you know, argued for that. Huntington, you know, most famously. But if you actually look at the evidence, and this is something that we do in the chapter, it's far from compelling. And again, there are a range of reasons. One of them is a sort of a psychological behavioral bias we look at, which is that something like China is very salient. We're looking at China, China's in the news, we're seeing China is growing at 10%. We're not looking at, are the autocratic disasters? What about Zimbabwe? What about many other failed dictatorships which are doing poorly? So if the, you know, as in fact the research shows, if you average across democracies and across non-democratic regimes, democracies on average don't do any worse. In fact, they're less volatile than non-democratic regimes, and that actually fits our intuition about India and China, right? I mean, China has had spectacular lows and spectacular highs.
So then, would you say that, given that context and given the, let's say, advantage we have being a democracy, do you see us sort of faring better, let's say, as an economy or as people compared to, let's say, China?
You know, in a sense, it's difficult to compare across systems because, you know, despite our chaos and so on, no Indian I know would genuinely want to give up our democratic system for the Chinese system and thereby get a higher standard of living. Likewise, the Chinese don't want to give up their system and, you know, and switch to ours. But having said that, the one big advantage of our system, which the Chinese don't have, is we have a built-in system of transition between regimes called elections. Right? The Chinese don't have that. And the problem that they're facing, that they will face at some point, is a transition. At some point, the Chinese middle class will grow large enough that they will clamor for more democratic reforms, more freedom, freedom of expression. And then what does the Communist Party of China do? What does the regime do? They're going to have some kind of a transition plan, which they don't have. And what they've been doing so far, in a sense, is buying the support of the populace by keeping on delivering high growth, and therefore no one wants to rock the boat. But at some point, when that growth rate starts, and it already is tapering down, and some kind of economic crisis hits China, then let's see what happens. So we are not going to go as high as they went, but nor are we going to collapse down.
Right, and I think you've hit upon something very pertinent. In my view, the lack of democracy is that big sort of speed breaker which China will encounter very soon, and it is related to the growing middle class, as you said, the internet explosion and access to information, and also if you see statistically, they will soon run out of jobs for that huge emerging pool of graduates who are coming out of Chinese universities and also from global universities where they are studying. So, these are graduates who have seen the world differently and who are seeing the differences between a democracy and a non-democratic nation. And they're going to come back and, ask for that new system. Do you see that, happening sort of sooner than later, or do you think, it's going to take a while before there's some real shakeout happening there?
Well, again, all China predictions usually end up being wrong, and people have predicted the implosion of the Chinese system many times. They've all been, including me and many others, we've always been proved wrong. I mean, the Chinese have an incredible way of their system keeps reinventing itself. I don't see an imminent crisis. This current transition in their regime, despite some glitches, seem to have been managed reasonably well. I would say looking forward 5, 10, 15, years, 20 years, when that crunch comes, if, it could come sooner, they'll have to confront that problem. And that's where we have a built-in advantage in our system.
Certainly. Let's change the subject to something lighter. In your book, you touched upon the element of luck and the role it plays in individual success, or even success in areas like, I believe, cricket. It's a late Saturday evening, and the audience would do with a dose of cricket.
Yeah, so there's one of the fun things we look at in the book. We all have this question, how do you measure the role of luck in our lives? Someone is successful, someone else less successful. What role did luck play versus one's own innate intrinsic abilities, talent, God-given gift, whatever you want to call it? Now, labor economists, of course, this kind of thing is their bread and butter. But there's a basic problem, again, methodological or a conceptual problem, which is how do you disentangle the role of luck and of innate ability? For example, other things equal, if you go to Harvard, you're going to do better than if you didn't go to Harvard. Or if you go to IIT or IIM, you're going to do better than you went to a generic business school or generic whatever. But why did you get in? I mean, getting into Harvard is partly about luck, but also partly about ability, right? And it's hard to disentangle those in a way that's satisfying methodologically. So, we draw on some interesting and fun research by two economists. Is there some way to get our hands on the pure effect of luck rather than skill? And they came up with a very clever way of testing this. So in test cricket, as played among national squads, national teams, something that is determined purely by luck is when you debut as a test player, debuting at home versus abroad is a matter of luck, because those rotations are set off years in advance. And when you first are invited to join the national squad, right, whether you debut at home or abroad is truly a matter of luck. You can't select one or the other. Okay? Now, why is that important? Well, it turns out that there's a huge difference in the lifetime career performances of test cricketers who debut at home versus those who debut abroad. And in fact, and we have given you the numbers in the book, the amount of the difference, both for batsmen and bowlers, and the amount to the difference between, say, a middling player and a star. So this is, a pretty big difference. There are lots of interesting explanations, and I'm sure you guys have all kinds of theories. Why is there that home field advantage? Is it because on your home turf, a newer player is more comfortable, they can hone their technique? Is it because you just know home conditions better, you know the pitch better? But what's interesting about this is, it makes sense that in your debut season, there'd be a big difference. But there's an effect over a whole lifetime. That's the extraordinary thing. Now that really is luck, right? Your whole life hangs on a coin toss in a sense.
Yeah, you pretty much brought it down to that, right, through cricket. Are you planning to look at some more research to say, well, what is the role of luck in our individual lives, in terms of careers, or, how we are termed as a successful person overall? Do you see some good methodologies or tools out there that, one can really delve into, say, we often hear this phrase like, I'd rather be lucky than intelligent, right, or vice versa. So should we all start wishing for that, saying, I just want to be lucky rather than intelligent?
Well, I don't know if I want to draw that lesson, because obviously everything is, being smart also helps, and being lucky is also important. But I think the point of those sort of anecdotes is that this again is, goes back to some very basic behavioral psychology, that as human beings we have an innate desire to impose order on the universe, right? Our ancestors looked up at the night sky and they didn't see just a blur of stars, they saw the constellations and the zodiac, right? In all ancient civilizations came up with very similar pictures that they saw in the sky. So we want to impose order on a chaotic universe, which is fine, which is what we have to do to survive. But what one often forgets is that there is some irreducible element of randomness, if you want to call it luck, random, call it fate if you want, call it karma. You can use a number of different names for it, that you cannot eliminate. And that's the point that we're trying to make. Whether it's cricket, whether it's elections, 2004, or any other election, there's a role of luck that you cannot just rule out. And sometimes, not always, luck is what determines the outcome. And then the other thing that human beings love to do, and this is what psychological research tells us, is that after something has happened, we try and explain what happened and rationalize it, ex post facto. Build a theory to explain why what happened just happened makes sense. And sometimes there is no rationality behind what happened.
True. Really looking at luck as that variable, but you don't know what is the exact coefficient or correlation, but certainly there is something, right?
Well, and the point I'm trying to make really, Kumar, is that disentangling the role of luck from things that we can understand, we can predict, we can measure, is difficult to do. But also the human mind, I think intrinsically, and this is again not me saying this, but psychological research, wants a well-ordered, well-reasoned understanding of events, and we all like to construct a narrative around things. We talk about several cases of this wanting to create a narrative. So whether it is why are we apathetic, and a narrative about the effect of globalization on the market and so on, because those narratives are compelling, right? When we love literature because which is not part of your festival, but we love it because it tells us a great story. It hangs together, it makes sense.
And I guess at a certain level it makes us feel in control, right?
Absolutely. Of
knowing what's happening around us.
Right, and maybe
understanding it at some level.
And accepting the basic, irreducible randomness is difficult to do. And maybe Devdutt next door could tell us, how mythology helps us understand and deal with it. But it's a tough thing to do.
Sure. So just one more question before we throw the forum open to the audience. Yeah. There was one interesting thing you mentioned in the book around seat belts. Yes. And there was some interesting research which they did on whether seat belts actually save lives. So let's hear it from you.
Sure. So this is another fun, not that traffic fatality is fun, but another fun piece of research, which is, and what we're trying to do in the book, without being pedantic, is expose the reader to some interesting concepts, the counterfactual, central to economics, to social science, but not often well understood, which simply means if you make a statement, what's the alternative against which you're comparing it? So seatbelts are a great example. We all assume, it's common sense to assume seatbelts save lives, and that's certainly what the scientific and the technical research shows us. It goes back to some very important work by Sam Peltzman from Chicago back in the 70s. He was thinking about it as an economist, not as an engineer or a technician. See, just step back. When we're told that wearing your seatbelt gives you, let's say, a 20% higher probability of surviving an accident, where do those numbers come from? From tests done with crash test dummies, right? So they put a dummy into a car and then they crash the vehicle, and they see whether without a seatbelt, if that test dummy would have survived. So that's a technical approach, right? Technical or an engineering way of thinking about it. What's the problem? What's it missing? It's missing the human reaction, right? So what Peltzman found, which was extraordinary, and he was looking at the US case, we'll also look at some data from India, but what Peltzman found for the US is when seatbelt use became mandatory in the US, there was actually no effect, no impact on safety. And why was that? The reason was what's called moral hazard. The reason was, someone is nodding, so you figured it out. The reason was that a driver who felt safer wearing a seatbelt could now drove more rashly, took more risks than before. And so the two things exactly canceled or offset. That's what Peltzman called it, the offsetting. So yes, wearing a seatbelt by itself makes it driving safer, but then the human reaction, which is that now I feel safe, so I can drive faster, I can go down the curve a little faster, or think that I'm on a Formula One racer. It actually offsets the effect. And there are all kinds of great examples. Sports. So there's also research that shows, for example, that protective gear in sports doesn't have the effect. So whether it's hockey or whichever sport you want, requiring players to wear, whether it's getting drivers of two-wheelers to wear a helmet, doesn't actually increase safety exactly for that reason.
Interesting. I think that's probably got something to do with the increase in fast car sales in Mumbai and Delhi, right? people think it's all safe, and let's just mow down everybody else. But with that, let's take some questions from the audience. As you've seen, Vivek and Rupa's book covers some very eclectic topics and very anecdotal, and a lot of sort of research and thinking gone into it. So happy to take some questions.
My question is, the way I believe it, and I want an economist answer, to put a stamp on it, is the better prepared you are, you're more, I guess, the luckier you get. I'm not trying to put a cliche here, but I just believe that you start looking out for those quote-unquote opportunities, right? So is that a scientifically valid statement?
Well, no, that's an interesting idea. And now it's very hard to test for that for the reason I suggested. But the cricket example actually doesn't fit your paradigm, because whether you debut at home or abroad truly is a matter of luck. I mean, unless you have some kind of astrological theory that you entered the squad and you already knew somehow in a past birth that you're going to debut abroad, or at home or abroad. But apart from that kind of explanation, but that's a very special case. I agree with you. This is the reason labor economists have, and you framed it very nicely, which is that, yes, if you're better prepared, you work harder, and so on, you're more likely to pick opportunities. And if that's wrongly measured, that could show up as luck when in fact it's not. So I think that's what your hypothesis is interesting, and will be very hard to test statistically, but I think the concept is interesting.
No fan of the Chinese political system, but don't you think there has been enough research to suggest that young politicians, at least the politicians who have reached the Lok Sabha right now, are innately related to someone whose father, mother, or someone was there, especially in the Indian political system? And contrast this to the US political system, you still see people from all walks of life, lawyers and other people joining politics over there. A direct contrast, our Prime Minister hopeful is above 60 and he is a youth icon. The social media really wants him to win the 2014 elections. But there, by the age of 50, you are the President of the United States of America. So what do you have to think about? Aren't we losing our advantage over there to countries like the United States and other global countries?
Well, you raised a very interesting question about the dynastic element of Indian politics, and Patrick French has done some great work on actually quantifying that, how pervasive that is. Not just the first family that everyone talks about, but most members of the Lok Sabha actually have an uncle, an auntie, a parent or cousin, someone who is also a politician who is their mentor or got them in. So now, one can think about it in different ways. Philosophically, it's a difficult problem to handle because, in a sense, there's nothing undemocratic about dynastic politics. I think, I suspect Avleen, who was at our session yesterday, wouldn't agree with this proposition. But there's nothing philosophically problematic, because after all, if the defense that the Congress is always given for why they continue this dynastic system is, well, they win elections, right? And in a democratic polity, if a voter decides to vote because they recognize someone's name, they think they'll be trustworthy, who are we to say that no, you shouldn't vote that way? That's one point. And the second is that even you mentioned the US, well, what about the Bush family, the Clinton family? There are a lot of dynasties, even in the US. The Kennedys, yeah, there are a lot of the Cuomos. There are a lot of the Daleys in Chicago. So there are lots of dynastic families all over the world. It's not a unique problem, a unique situation, so you put it more neutrally. In India, but certainly I think and we could spend all night talking about this, so I'll make it very brief. But yes, I mean, more political competition is one way of getting at that. So if one has a very healthy electoral competition where there are all kinds of different parties, some may be dynastic, some are not, then let's see what the voters pick and what really resonates with them as an issue.
On a separate note, I would also say it's not just in politics. I mean, in India, what are the two public figures that you've got? And they emanate from politics and Bollywood. I mean, Bollywood is far more dynastic than politics.
And
right?
business
there are
houses
probably
also.
4 families which cut it, right? So politics by that measure is far less dynastic than Bollywood, where there is no, voter involvement required, if you will. There is no regulation at all. You don't elect anybody. It's just public opinion, public perception, and the vote happens every Friday at the box office. But I think it has got something to do with the credibility of having seen a last name over a certain number of years or certain generations, and expecting that because this person belongs to that same family or to that same lineage, you assume that they are delivering quality or that they will deliver quality. So I guess it's more to do with us rather than with the dynasties themselves.
In India, Congress has been mainly ruling this country. Congressmen.
Yeah, but they've been elected by people, right?
They've been elected by people.
So that's the difference.
But they are mainly elected. There aren't many parties ruling else than Congress.
So what's your question?
My question is, what difference is between China's progress and India's downfall?
Well, I'm not sure I accept the framing of the question.
Yes.
The two countries are evolving quite differently. Our politics are different from theirs, and yes, economic development is influenced by your political system. There's no question about it. But I think this is where, as an economist, I have to say, maybe we can end on this note, that one cannot take a narrowly economic view of life and of. So if you look at the totality of the Indian experience versus the Chinese experience, it's true the Chinese GDP is higher and their growth rate is higher. But it's also true that the Chinese lack basic liberties that we Indians take for granted. And if you evaluate that whole package, I don't think, despite what they may tell pollsters, no Indian will genuinely in their heart of hearts want to trade our system, chaotic and messy and so on as it is, for a slightly higher living standard in China, much as the Chinese don't want our system.
Certainly, we wouldn't be, sitting in Shanghai and, having this conversation.
We couldn't have this conversation in China.
Absolutely not, right? So, like Vivek said, that's a liberty we are taking for granted, and I don't think we can yet talk about the downfall of India in comparison to China. Certainly, we got a, slower growth rate, but that's about it. No, there is a difference, but who says that to be a good country and a good economy or a good society, you need to have a double-digit growth rate? I mean, the US has had a low single-digit growth rate for a long, long time, and they're a good society. So,
US has independence for approximately 167 years. So we have got independence for only 63 years.
And you've answered the question. We are a younger republic, right? We did not get independence in a planned way, right? We fought for it and we got it at a certain point in time, and we had to rebuild our institutions, our systems, our society in the last 60, 65 years. Yes, we can debate whether that process of rebuilding and the process of creation of those institutions or systems and processes has been efficient, or has it been thought through correctly or not, or has it been implemented. Certainly not everything is right, but I don't think we can, by any measure say that, it's about downfall in India. Yes, we've gone from a high growth rate, 7 or 8 years ago to a lower growth rate, but that's about it. So we let it rest at that. And on that note, I would say, well, Asia's first non-fiction festival is happening in India, not in China.
Thank you.